It always starts the same way. Someone gets a tiny cut. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic. 12 hours later, their arm is swollen. 24 hours later, they're shaking with fever. By day 3, they're gone. Not because the wound was severe, but because the world no longer has hospitals, antibiotics, or second chances. That is the real terror of the collapse. Death arrives quietly, disguised as something you once ignored. And before you make the classic mistake, don't assume basic first aid will save you. Your competitors online keep repeating the same dead world advice. Clean it, wrap it, keep pressure, hope it heals. Hope is not a protocol. Sterile gauze is not a strategy. Infection doesn't respect your gear list. It respects chemistry. And if you don't know how to extract real antimicrobial force from the wild, you are unarmed on a battlefield you cannot see. This is where the standard changes. You're not here to avoid dying. That's the beginner tier. In the post-collapse landscape, your mission is higher, to rebuild your biological defenses from zero, using the physics, biochemistry, and field logic of the terrain itself. Reconstruction, not survival. So here is the blueprint you will operate from. 7 natural antibiotic formulas, each one a biochemical weapon derived from wild plants, each one capable of interrupting infection when nothing else is coming to save you. Resins that scorch bacteria out of a wound, sulfur compounds that detonate microbial colonies, tannins that lock infection behind an improvised chemical barricade. Learn them, and you seize control of your fate. Fail to, and the collapse will claim you the same way it claims everyone who still believes the old rules apply. Pine resin is the closest thing you have to a battlefield antiseptic after the collapse. Not folklore, not natural healing, a chemical weapon. Its terpene load tears through bacterial membranes, and when used correctly, it creates a seal strong enough to prevent a wound from spiraling into sepsis. The #1 killer when hospitals are extinct. Most survivors still get it wrong. They scrape raw resin and smear it on the wound. That is contamination, not treatment. Raw resin carries dirt, bark microbes, and fungal spores. Exactly what you're trying to keep out. The real protocol is simple and unforgiving. Heat until it liquefies. Wait for the impurities to rise and blacken. Filter fast, and apply while still molten. That moment, seconds long, is where the difference between sterilization and infection is decided. Once applied, resin does what bandages and sterile rooms used to do. It closes the breach. It slows bleeding, forms a chemical scab, and creates an oxygen-poor barrier hostile to bacterial expansion. It buys time, hours, sometimes days, for the body to regroup. That window is everything. Remember this principle. Resin is not for comfort, and it is not for beauty. It is the line between a survivable wound and a fatal fever. If you don't master this formula, the collapse will teach you the lesson the hard way. Wild garlic is not food in a collapse. It's a biochemical detonation. When you crush it, allicin is released, a sulfur-based compound engineered by nature to kill microbes fast. This is one of the few plant antibiotics potent enough to challenge early-stage infection internally and externally. If pine resin is armor, wild garlic is the strike that pushes bacteria back before they establish a foothold. But here is the operational detail most people overlook. Allicin has a lifespan measured in minutes. Crush too early, and you lose its power before it ever touches the wound. Crush too late, and the infection has already advanced. Timing is the weapon. You activate allicin only when you are ready to apply or ingest it immediately. There is no prep ahead in this protocol. Mistiming equals microbial survival. Applied externally, a fresh paste forces a chemical shock onto the infected tissue. The sulfur compounds penetrate the superficial layers, destabilizing bacterial colonies and slowing their spread. The pain? Expected. The burn? Necessary. In this world, comfort is irrelevant. Outcome is everything. Internally, wild garlic becomes even more strategic. When consumed in controlled doses, it pushes back against early systemic infection, the stage where fever rises, lymph nodes swell, and you feel the collapse happening inside your bloodstream. But this is where amateurs kill themselves. They treat wild garlic like a harmless herb and overload. The result? Stomach lining irritation, vomiting, dehydration. The perfect conditions for infection to overtake a weakened body. The correct internal dose is small, frequent, and always paired with hydration. You're not trying to nuke your system. You're applying pressure, just enough to shift the balance in your favor without compromising the body's ability to fight. This formula is indispensable during food contamination events, spoiled water exposure, or low-grade infections that begin internally rather than through a wound. In a world without pharmaceuticals, gastrointestinal infections escalate with terrifying speed. Wild garlic is one of the few tools left that can interrupt that chain reaction before it becomes fatal. The doctrine is simple and non-negotiable. Crush on demand, apply immediately, dose cautiously. Used with precision, wild garlic is a biochemical equalizer. Used carelessly, it becomes another liability in a world where liabilities end lives. Master this formula and you'll carry one of the collapse's most reliable internal defense weapons. Fail to, and infection will exploit your hesitation the same way it exploits everyone who still thinks survival is guesswork. Yarrow doesn't advertise its power. It looks fragile, almost insignificant, until you understand why soldiers carried it for centuries. In a post-collapse world with no trauma care, Yarrow becomes a dual-phase asset. It slows bleeding and suppresses infection at the same time. Nothing else in the wild delivers that combination with this level of reliability. Its strength lies in two mechanisms working simultaneously. First, the plant's alkaloids signal blood vessels to constrict, reducing surface bleeding and buying the body time. That time window is the only reason many wounds remain survivable. Second, its antimicrobial compounds push back against bacterial expansion in the exposed tissue. While other plants heal or disinfect, Yarrow does both, fast enough to matter when the clock is already against you. But amateurs ruin it. They rub whole leaves onto a wound and think they've treated something. That is bushcraft theater, not survival protocol. The correct method demands maceration, crushing the leaves and stems until the fibers break and the juice releases. The paste that forms is the real tool. Its surface area is what drives the compounds into the wound margin. Applied immediately, Yarrow creates what operators call a window extender, a temporary tactical delay where the wound stays contained long enough for secondary treatment, resin sealing, deeper cleaning, or evacuation from contamination. In field conditions, this delay is everything. Infection doesn't wait. The wound doesn't negotiate. Yarrow holds the line just long enough for you to take the next step. This is not a cure. It is battlefield control. You're not healing. You're stabilizing the collapse happening inside your tissue. And in a world with no sutures, no sterile rooms, and no intravenous antibiotics, stabilization is often the only reason you live long enough to fight the next phase. Understand this principle. Yarrow is not about comfort or natural wellness. It is a tactical tool that stops your body from losing time. Every survivor who lasts more than a year in the wasteland learns this plant by sight, by smell, by instinct. Because the moment you hesitate to use it is the moment the wound chooses its direction, recovery or spiral. Learn to apply it correctly, and you control the first minutes after trauma. Get it wrong, and you'll watch the wound turn against you faster than you can react. Usnea looks fragile, pale green threads swaying from dead branches. But in a world without hospitals, it is one of the most potent broad-spectrum antimicrobials you can deploy. When infection stops responding to surface treatments, when the wound begins to smell sweet or metallic, when redness forms a hard ring that spreads hour by hour, that's when Usnea becomes the difference between containment and systemic collapse. Its power comes from usneic acid, a compound strong enough to disrupt bacterial and fungal metabolism simultaneously. That matters because post-collapse infections rarely stay simple. They become mixed, layered, opportunistic. Resin can seal, Yarrow can stabilize, garlic can attack, but Usnea penetrates. It does the slow, deep chemical work none of the others can reach. But here is the part that destroys inexperienced survivors. They misidentify it. They grab any hanging lichen and assume it's medicinal. That error has consequences. Not all lichens contain usneic acid, and some carry soil contaminants that make infections worse. The operational test is simple and non-negotiable. Usnea has an elastic central cord. Pull it apart lightly. If a white core stretches inside like a tiny tendon, you have the right lichen. No cord, no medicine. Once identified, the extraction can't rely on alcohol, because post-collapse alcohol is rarely pure, and contamination ruins the formula. Instead, you use heat-assisted infusion, a long, low-temperature steep that coaxes the usneic acid out without burning it. The result is a concentrated liquid or paste with slow-release antimicrobial force. Usnea is patient chemistry. It doesn't shock the wound. It infiltrates it. Its real value emerges in situations most survivors are not prepared for. Puncture wounds where bacteria hide deep, fungal infiltration from damp environments, slow infections that smolder under the skin while you feel your strength draining day by day. These infections don't announce themselves loudly, but they kill with precision. Usnea is one of the only wild tools that can push back against both bacterial and fungal threats at the same time. Understand this doctrine clearly. Usnea is not a first response. It's the middle war weapon, the formula you deploy when the infection refuses to retreat. You use it when the wound begins to harden, when movement becomes painful, when fever shadows the edges of your awareness. It is not fast, but it is relentless. And in collapse conditions, relentlessness is survival. If you fail to master Usnea, its identification, extraction, and timing, you leave a gap in your defensive line, and infection will exploit that gap every single time. Plantain is the plant most survivors walk past without ever understanding what they've just ignored. Wide leaves, low to the ground, unimpressive at a glance, but chemically, it is one of the most valuable tools left in a world where dirt, rust, and debris infect wounds faster than you can clean them. When a cut turns cloudy, when pus forms, when pressure builds beneath the skin, that is not a wound anymore. That is contamination taking territory. Plantain's job is to pull it back. Its power comes from allantoin, a compound that accelerates tissue regeneration while simultaneously suppressing bacterial momentum. But what makes plantain indispensable is not its healing factor. It's the pulling effect. This plant can draw embedded contaminants, splinters, soil microbes, and early-stage pus toward the surface through osmotic pressure. That is something no bandage can replicate in a collapse environment. But amateurs get seduced by convenience and use the leaf whole. That is a mistake. A whole leaf sits on top of the wound like a shield. It doesn't extract anything. The correct protocol is a macerated poultice. You crush the leaf until the fibers rupture and the juices release, then apply that mass directly to the wound. Within minutes, the skin softens, pressure shifts, and contamination begins to migrate upward. That movement is the first sign you've interrupted the infection's advance. Plantain is the tool you use when a wound isn't clean anymore, when bacteria have already gained ground. This is not prevention. This is reversal. Resin seals, Yarrow buys time, garlic attacks microbes, but Plantain reaches into the wound and retrieves what should never have been left inside. In puncture wounds, thorn injuries, dirty cuts, and early abscess formation, Plantain acts as a manual extraction system. The body cannot perform fast enough on its own. Its greatest strength shows at night. You apply the poultice, wrap it lightly, and let it work while you rest. By morning, the wound often displays the truth: whitened material drawn out, reduced swelling, and a softer, more workable infection site ready for the next phase of treatment. In the old world, this would be a supportive remedy. In post-collapse reality, it is survival engineering. Understand this doctrine. Plantain is not the cure. It is the reset button. It clears the battlefield so other treatments can strike. Without it, infections become hidden, layered, and harder to target. With it, you bring the enemy out into the open, where you can finish the job. In the wasteland, the difference between a wound you can treat and one that consumes you is often measured in what you can pull out. Plantain gives you that leverage. Juniper is not subtle. It doesn't whisper its effects the way Plantain or Yarrow do. It hits hard, fast, and chemically. One of the few remaining tools in the wild capable of pushing back against internal infections when your symptoms shift from discomfort to danger. When your gut twists, when fever rises without a visible wound, when contaminated water or spoiled food slips past your defenses, Juniper becomes the line separating recovery from a downward spiral you cannot climb out of. Its strength lies in volatile oils, powerful antimicrobial agents that survive heat when handled correctly. But this is where most collapse survivors sabotage themselves. They boil Juniper to death, turning the formula into a bitter, useless tea. The protocol is precise: a low, controlled simmer, just enough to coax the oils out without destroying them. This decoction becomes a rare internal weapon against bacteria colonizing the digestive tract, kidneys, or urinary system, places you cannot reach with poultices or resin. But here is the reality the old world softened for you. Juniper is potent enough that misuse becomes its own threat. Take too much, and you stress the kidneys, dehydrate yourself, and weaken the very systems trying to keep you alive. This is why collapse operators treat Juniper not as a tonic, but as an intervention, something deployed with intent, not habit. You dose small, you observe, you hydrate. You treat it like ammunition, not food. Externally, Juniper decoction becomes a field-grade wash for contaminated wounds when clean water is impossible to find. The oils coat the wound surface, forcing bacteria into a chemical retreat that plain water, no matter how much you boil, could never achieve. In swamp biomes, coastal ruins, or post-disaster zones where moisture breeds fungal and bacterial overgrowth, this wash becomes a survival tool you return to again and again. But context matters. Juniper is not your first strike or your daily maintenance formula. It is your countermeasure, the tool you deploy when infection is spreading internally, or when a wound needs a chemical flush more aggressive than water but gentler than resin. If garlic is your shockwave and Usnea is your slow infiltrator, Juniper is the targeted strike, controlled, precise, and timed. Understand this doctrine. Juniper is not a cure-all. It is a scalpel in a world where most people only know how to swing hammers. Use it to cut infection off at its early systemic stage, and you regain control. Use it blindly, and you compromise your organs, the one thing you cannot replace in the wasteland. Master its restraint, and Juniper will save you from the kinds of infections that kill without ever breaking the skin. In the old world, charcoal and bark were afterthoughts, campfire leftovers, forest debris. In the collapse, they become a hybrid weapon, a chemical sealant engineered from heat, pressure, and tannin-rich bark. This formula exists for one purpose: to stop a dirty, worsening wound from turning into a death sentence when every other tool is out of reach, when the cut is deep, when the smell shifts from sharp to sour, when swelling hardens and the skin pulses with internal pressure. You are no longer dealing with a surface infection. You are dealing with a breach, and breaches must be sealed. Charcoal provides the first half of the strategy: adsorption. Not absorption, adsorption. It pulls toxins, bacterial byproducts, and surface contaminants toward itself like a chemical magnet. But charcoal alone is incomplete. It extracts, but it does not defend. That is where tannin-loaded bark enters the formula. These tannins constrict tissue, suppress bacterial activity, and form a temporary barrier, the closest thing the wild offers to a primitive antiseptic dressing. Most survivors misuse this formula by smearing cold charcoal dust onto a wound. That is an invitation for disaster. Charcoal made in the wild carries ash residue, insects, unburned organic matter, all of which introduce more contaminants. The protocol is non-negotiable. You sterilize the charcoal by reheating it until it glows lightly, then let it cool in a clean container. The bark must also be heated or boiled to release its tannins. Only then do you combine the two into a thick, tar-like paste. Applied fast, this hybrid mixture does three things. It pulls out the surface-level toxins the body hasn't yet contained. It suppresses bacterial expansion with tannins that tighten the wound margin. And it creates a temporary seal. Ugly, dark, but strategically essential. This is the formula you deploy when you have nothing left. Not because it is weak, but because it is versatile. Abscess forming? Use it. Puncture wound beginning to tunnel? Use it. A cut contaminated with soil, rust, or stagnant water? Use it. Nothing else works as broadly and as brutally under field conditions. But understand this clearly. This is not a healing formula. It is a containment formula. Its job is to halt the infection long enough for you to rotate into stronger plant antibiotics or perform deeper cleaning once your environment is safer. It is the chemical sandbag wall you build when the flood has already begun. If you fail to respect this formula, its heat requirements, its timing, its role in the sequence, you turn a tactical tool into a liability. But when used correctly, it becomes one of the most reliable last resort defenses against runaway infection in a world where mistakes carry a body count. Use it to halt the collapse happening inside the wound and to buy the hours you need to fight back with precision. Infection in a post-collapse world is not a medical issue. It is a tactical scenario. Every wound, every fever, every shift in pain or color is a battlefield signal. Your job is not to treat it. Your job is to identify the threat profile and deploy the correct biochemical weapon before the infection escalates beyond control. Misreading the situation is how survivors die with supplies still in their pack. Choosing the right formula begins with a simple but unforgiving question. What type of wound are you dealing with? A deep laceration that won't stop weeping contamination requires pine resin, the only field asset capable of sealing a breach fast. A puncture wound that hides infection deep beneath the surface demands plantain first, because you must pull the contaminants upward before you can kill anything. A slowly expanding redness or a hardened ring calls for Usnea, the deep infiltrator that works where surface treatments fail. A fresh, bleeding cut needs Yarrow for stabilization before you even think about anything else. Timing is the second determinant. Infection operates on momentum. If the wound is minutes old and bleeding openly, resin is premature. It traps contaminants inside. If the wound is hours old and beginning to throb with heat, now resin becomes essential. If fever appears and the lymph nodes tighten, garlic or juniper are no longer optional. Internal infection has begun, and you must strike from within. Environment is the third factor, one most survivors completely ignore. In swampy regions, fungal presence skyrockets, so Usnea becomes a mandatory part of your rotation. In cold, dry climates, resin flow is limited. You must harvest early or lose access entirely. In ruined urban environments filled with rust, debris, and stagnant water, Plantain becomes your primary first-line defense because every wound is a contamination wound. The terrain dictates the tactic. Refusal to adapt is fatal. Then you assess escalation signals, increasing redness, rapid swelling, pulses of heat, streaking lines, foul odor, fever spikes, sudden fatigue. Each signal narrows your options until only one formula fits the situation. If the wound evolves faster than your treatment, you rotate. Yarrow to stabilize, Plantain to pull, Usnea to infiltrate, resin to seal. This is not improvisation. It is sequencing, the same way a field medic stabilizes, cleans, then sutures. You are replicating lost medical infrastructure using biochemistry and discipline. And above all, you follow the doctrine that governs every infection in the collapse. Hesitation is lethal. Misapplication is worse. Delay lets the infection grow. Incorrect treatment locks the enemy deeper inside the tissue. You must move with clarity. You must treat the infection as an adversary that adapts, spreads, and exploits your fear. Master this decision-making matrix, and you reclaim the authority the old world once handed to hospitals. Fail, and the wasteland will take you the same way it takes everyone who tries to wing it through infection. Precision is your only advantage now. When the world collapsed, medicine didn't simply disappear. It reverted to its primordial state. The antibiotics you once trusted were not inventions. They were distilled forms of chemicals nature had always used to defend itself. The only difference is that now you are the one responsible for extracting them. This is the new contract between you and the wasteland. No hospitals, no pharmaceuticals, no sterile rooms. Only raw biochemistry and the discipline to wield it without error. Most survivors never make that transition. They cling to old-world thinking. That infection is something that happens to them, something external, something they can hope away with rest or improvisation. That mindset kills more people than starvation or violence. Infection is not passive. It is an active, expanding enemy. And in a world without clinical intervention, the only people who survive are the ones who abandon the identity of patient and adopt the role of operator. To operate is to see every wound as a calculation, every plant as a tool, every hour of hesitation as lost ground. Pine resin becomes artificial armor. Yarrow becomes your stabilizer. Plantain becomes your extractor. Usnea becomes your infiltrator. Garlic becomes your internal suppressor. Juniper becomes your countermeasure. Charcoal tannin paste becomes your barricade. You stop hoping for healing and start constructing it, piece by biochemical piece. But the deeper transformation is philosophical. In the old world, survival was health. In the collapse, survival is engineering, understanding how to manipulate chemistry, moisture, temperature, pressure, and tissue response with the precision of someone who knows there is no backup plan. Infection forces you to evolve from consumer to builder, from dependent to sovereign. Sovereignty is not poetic, it is operational. It means you no longer wait for rescue. You produce the rescue. And this is the ultimate doctrine. In the post-collapse world, infection is not a medical emergency. It is a test of whether you understand how nature defends itself and whether you can apply those same defenses to your own body. The ones who learn these formulas don't just survive. They rewrite what survival even means. They don't treat wounds. They manage battlefields. They don't rely on systems. They become systems. They don't fear infection. They outmaneuver it. The collapse erased the world you knew. These 7 formulas do more than restore a piece of it. They mark the threshold between those who die from preventable wounds and those who rise with the hard, cold authority of someone who has mastered the chemistry of survival. You asked for antibiotics. What you gained is sovereignty over your own biological fate.